In prosody, alliterative verse is a form of verse that uses alliteration as the principal ornamental device to help indicate the underlying metrical structure, as opposed to other devices such as rhyme. The most commonly studied traditions of alliterative verse are those found in the oldest literature of the Germanic languages, where scholars use the term alliterative poetry rather broadly to indicate a tradition which not only shares alliteration as its primary ornament, but also certain metrical characteristics. The Old English epic Beowulf, as well as most other Old English poetry, the Old High German Muspilli, the Old Saxon Heliand, the Old Norse Poetic Edda, and many Middle English poems such as Piers Plowman, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and the Alliterative Morte Arthur all use alliterative verse. Alliterative verse can be found in many other languages as well. The Finnish Kalevala and the Estonian Kalevi poet both use alliterative forms derived from folk tradition. Traditional Turkish verse, for example that of the Uyghur, is also alliterative. Common Germanic origins and features. The poetic forms found in the various Germanic languages are not identical, but there is sufficient similarity to make it clear that they are closely related traditions, stemming from a common Germanic source. Knowledge about that common tradition, however, is based almost entirely on inference from later poetry. One statement we have about the nature of alliterative verse from a practicing alliterative poet is that of Snorri Sturluson in the Prose Edda. He describes metrical patterns and poetic devices used by skaldic poets around the year 1200. Snorri's description has served as the starting point for scholars to reconstruct alliterative meters beyond those of Old Norse. There have been many different metrical theories proposed, all of them attended with controversy. Looked at broadly, however, certain basic features are common from the earliest to the latest poetry. Alliterative verse has been found in some of the earliest monuments of Germanic literature. The golden horns of Gallius, discovered in Denmark and likely dating to the 4th century, bear this runic inscription in Proto-Norse: XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX stressed syllables, the first three of which alliterate on an LT, H and GT, X, and the last of which does not alliterate, essentially the same pattern found in much later verse. Originally all alliterative poetry was composed and transmitted orally, and much went unrecorded. The degree to which writing may have altered this oral art form remains much in dispute. Nevertheless, there is a broad consensus among scholars that the written verse retains many of the features of the spoken language. Metrical form. The core metrical features of traditional Germanic alliterative verse are as follows. They can be seen in the Gallius inscription above. A long line is divided into two half-lines. Half-lines are also known as verses, hemistichs, or distiches. The first is called the A verse, the second the B verse. The rhythm of the B verse is generally more regular than that of the A verse, helping listeners to perceive where the end of the line falls. A heavy pause, or caesura, separates the verses. Each verse usually has two heavily stressed syllables, referred to as lifts or beats. The first lift in the A verse alliterates with the first lift in the B verse. The second lift in the B verse does not alliterate with the first lifts. Some of these fundamental rules varied in certain traditions over time. Unlike in post-medieval English accentual verse, in which a syllable is either stressed or unstressed, Germanic poets were sensitive to degrees of stress. These can be thought of at three levels: most stressed, root syllables of nouns, adjectives, participles, infinitives; less stressed, root syllables, most finite verbs and adverbs; even less stressed, Most pronouns, weakly stressed adverbs, prepositions, conjunctions, parts of the verb to be, word endings. If a half-line contains one or more stress words, the root syllables will be the lifts. If it contains no stress words, the root syllables of any particles will be the lift. Rarely, even a proclitic can be the lift, either because there are no more heavily stressed syllables or because it is given extra stress for some particular reason. If a lift was occupied by a word with a short root vowel followed by only one consonant followed by an unstressed vowel cv, these two syllables were, in most circumstances, counted as only one syllable. This is called resolution. The patterns of unstressed syllables vary significantly in the alliterative traditions of different Germanic languages. The rules for these patterns remain imperfectly understood and subject to debate. Rules for alliteration. Alliteration fits naturally with the prosodic patterns of early Germanic languages. Alliteration essentially involves matching the left edges of stressed syllables. Early Germanic languages share a left prominent prosodic pattern. In other words, stress falls on the root syllable of a word, which is normally the initial syllable. This means that the first sound of a word was particularly salient to listeners. Traditional Germanic verse also had two particular rules about alliteration. All vowels alliterate with each other. The consonant clusters St, Sp and Sc are treated as separate sounds. The precise reasons for this are debated. The most common, but not uniformly accepted, theory for vowel alliteration is that words beginning with vowels all actually began with a glottal stop. Diction. The need to find an appropriate alliterating word gave certain other distinctive features to alliterative verse as well. Alliterative poets drew on a specialized vocabulary of poetic synonyms rarely used in prose texts and used standard images and metaphors called kennings. English alliterative verse. Old English poetic forms. Old English classical poetry, epitomized by Beowulf, follows the rules of traditional Germanic poetry outlined above, and is indeed a major source for reconstructing them. J.R.R. Tolkien's essay on translating Beowulf analyzes the rules as used in the poem. Some patterns of classical Old English verse begin to break down at the end of the Old English period. Moreover, Thomas Bredehoft has argued that an alternative system of non-classical Old English poetry, with looser constraints, existed alongside this classical verse. In Bredehoft's reading, this poetry is epitomized by those of Alfred of Encham's homilies, traditionally described as being in rhythmical prose. This section, however, focuses on the classical form. Metrical form is described above for the Germanic tradition as a whole. Each line of poetry in Old English consists of two half-lines of verses, with a pause or caesura in the middle of the line. Each half-line usually has two accented syllables. The following example from the poem The Battle of Maldon, spoken by the warrior of Beowulf, shows the usual pattern. For readers unfamiliar with Old English, clear indications of modern English meanings can be heard in the original, using phonetic approximations of the Old English sound letter system. Shall the harder, heart the keener, mood shall the more, as our main little. In addition to the rules outlined above, Old English poetry had constraints limiting the lengths of verses and the number and distribution of lifts and dips. However, there is still no consensus on what precisely the constraints were. These must also have varied slightly from one poem to another. The most widely used system for classifying Old English prosodic patterns is based on that developed by Edward Sivers and extended by Alan Joseph Bliss. Sivers' system is a method of categorization rather than a full theory of meter. It does not, in other words, purport to describe the system the Scots actually used to compose the verse, nor does it explain why certain patterns are favored or avoided. Sivers divided verses into 5 basic types labeled A. The system is founded upon accent alliteration, the quantity of vowels, and patterns of syllabic accentuation. Another popular system is that of Geoffrey Russell, which is predicated on a theory of meter involving 2 metrical feet per verse. Another again is that of Thomas Cable, which is based on the idea that each verse contains 4 syllables, with specific rules for the addition of extra unstressed syllables. Rules for alliteration. Alliteration is the principal ornamental feature of Old English poetry. 2 stressed syllables alliterate when they begin with the same sound. In addition to the general rules for alliteration in Germanic poetry listed above, there are some further complications due to sound changes in Old English. Unpalatized C alliterated with palatized C, apparently because the sounds were once just one sound. Unpalatized G likewise alliterated with palatized G and with the G inherited from Common Germanic J. There is not yet a consensus on why these alliterated, but must be partly because the first 2 Gs were once just one sound. The first stressed syllable of the off-verse, or second half-line, usually alliterates with one or both of the stressed syllables of the on-verse, or first half-line. The second stressed syllable of the off-verse does not usually alliterate with the others. The Middle English alliterative revival, just as rhyme was seen in some Anglo-Saxon poems. The use of alliterative verse continued into Middle English. Layamon's Brut, written in about 1215, uses a loose alliterative scheme. Starting in the mid-14th century, alliterative verse became popular in the English North, the West Midlands, and a little later in Scotland. The Pearl poet uses a complex scheme of alliteration, rhyme, and iambic meter in his Pearl, a more conventional alliterative meter in cleanness and patience, and alliterative verse alternating with rhymed quatrains in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. William Langland's Piers Plowman is an important English alliterative poem. It was written between 1360 and 1399. Though 1,000 years have passed between this work and the Golden Horn of Gallius, the poetic form remains much the same. Alliteration was sometimes used together with rhyme in Middle English work, as in Pearl and in the densely structured poem The Three Dead Kings. Middle English alliterative poets invented some innovative structures. The Pearl poet, for instance, often adds a third alliterating word to the first half-line, and the medial pause is not always strictly maintained. After the 15th century, alliterative verse became fairly uncommon. Possibly the last major poem in the tradition is William Dunbar's superb treatise of the Two Mariite Women, and the Widow. By the middle of the 16th century, the 4-beat alliterative line had completely vanished, at least from the written tradition. The last poem using the form that has survived, Scottish Field, was written in soon after 1515 for the circle of Thomas Stanley, 2nd Earl of Derby, in commemoration of the Battle of Flodden. Modern revival. Tolkien J.R. Tolkien, a scholar of Old and Middle English and of Old Norse, used alliterative verse extensively in both translations and original poetry. Most of his alliterative verse is in modern English, in a variety of styles, but he also composed Old English alliterative verses such as the Lair of the Children of Huron, published in the Lays of Beleriand. Tolkien also wrote alliterative verse based on other traditions, such as the Volsung Saga and Utlak-Vitha, in the legend of Sigurd and Gudrun, and the homecoming of Beorhtnoth Beorhthalmsson, describing the aftermath of the Battle of Maldon. His Gothic Bagme Bloma uses a trochaic meter, with irregular end rhymes and irregular alliteration in each line. It was published in Songs for the Philologists. He wrote a variety of pieces of alliterative verse in Old English, including parts of the Seafarer Ave version of these appears in the Notion Club papers. He also made translations including about 600 lines of Beowulf in verse. Louis' alliterative verse is occasionally written by other modern authors. C.S. Louis wrote a narrative poem of 742 lines called The Nameless Isle, published posthumously in Narrative Poems. Lines 562 to 567, or Auden W.H. Auden wrote a number of poems, including The Age of Anxiety, in or type of alliterative verse modified for modern English. The noun-laden style of the headlines makes the style of alliterative verse particularly apt for Auden's poem. Richard Wilbur's Junk opens with the lines. Other poets who have experimented with modern alliterative English verse include Ezra Pound in his version of The Seafarer. Many translations of Beowulf use alliterative techniques. Among recent ones, that of Seamus Heaney loosely follows the rules of modern alliterative verse, while the translations of Alan Sullivan and Timothy Murphy follow those rules more closely. Old Norse Poetic Forms. The inherited form of alliterative verse was modified somewhat in Old Norse poetry. In Old Norse, as a result of phonetic changes from the original Common Germanic language, many unstressed syllables were lost. This lent Old Norse verse a characteristic terseness. The lifts tended to be crowded together at the expense of the weak syllables. In some lines, the weak syllables have been entirely suppressed. For the Havamal, the various names of the Old Norse verse forms are given in the Prose Edda by Snorri Sturluson. The Hattitel, or list of verse forms, contains the names and characteristics of each of the fixed forms of Norse poetry. For near this lag a verse form close to that of Beowulf existed in runestones and in the Old Norse Eddas. In Norse, it was called for near this lag, which means past words law, or way of ancient words. The Norse poets tended to break up the verses into stanzas of from 2 to 8 lines, rather than writing continuous verse after the Old English model. The loss of unstressed syllables made these verses seem denser and more emphatic. The Norse poets, unlike the Old English poets, tended to make each line a complete syntactic unit, avoiding enjambment where a thought begun on one line continues through the following lines. Only seldom do they begin a new sentence in the second half-line. This example is from the Waking of Anganta. For near this lag has 2 lifts per half-line, with 2 or 3 unstressed syllables. At least 2 lifts, usually 3, alliterate, always including the main stave. It had a variant form called Malahatta, which adds an unstressed syllable to each half-line, making 6 to 8 unstressed syllables per line. Yodahatta. Change in form came with the development of Yodahatta, which means song or ballad meter, a stanzaic verse form that created 4-line stanzas. The odd-numbered lines were almost standard lines of alliterative verse with 4 lifts and 2 or 3 alliterations. With caesura, the even-numbered lines had 3 lifts and 2 alliterations, and no caesura. This example is from phrase Lament in Skirnismal. A number of variants occurred in Yodahatta, including Galdrahatta Akavithuhatta, which adds a 5th short line to the end of the stanza. In this form, usually the 5th line echoes the 4th one. Drotveat. These verse forms were elaborated even more into the skaldic poetic form called the Drotveat, meaning lordly verse, which added internal rhymes and other forms of assonance that go well beyond the requirements of Germanic alliterative verse and greatly resemble the Celtic forms. The Drotveat stanza had 8 lines, each having usually 3 lifts and almost invariably 6 syllables. Although other stress patterns appear, the verse is predominantly trochaic. In the odd-numbered lines, 2 of the stressed syllables alliterate with one another. 2 of the stressed syllables share partial rhyme of consonants with dissimilar vowels, not necessarily at the end of the word. In the even lines, the first stress syllable must alliterate with the alliterative stress syllables of the previous line. Two of the stress syllables rhyme, not necessarily at the end of the word. The last two syllables form a prosody. The requirements of this verse form were so demanding that occasionally the text of the poems had to run parallel, with one thread of syntax running through the on-side of the half-lines, and another running through the off-side. According to the Fagskinna collection of sagas, King Harald III of Norway uttered these lines of Drotverd at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. The internal assonances and the alliteration are imbolded krupum ve acutar fyr vapna, broken eigi at hjaldri I bugshaldar, thars moetask likar issok hausa. In battle, we do not creep behind a shield before the din of weapons. She who wore the necklace bade me to bear my head high in battle. When the battle axe seeks to shatter skulls. The bracketed words in the poem are syntactically separate, but interspersed within the text of the rest of the verse. The elaborate kennings manifested here are also practically necessary in this complex and demanding form, as much to solve metrical difficulties as for the sake of vivid imagery. Intriguingly, the saga claims that Harald improvised these lines after he gave a lesser performance. Harald judged that verse bad, and then offered this one in the more demanding form. While the exchange may be fictionalized, the scene illustrates the regard in which the form was held. Most Drotveit poems that survive appear in one or another of the Norse sagas. Several of the sagas are biographies of skaldic poets. Bran Hender. Bran Hender is a later development of Drotveit with 8 syllables per line instead of 6, with the similar rules of rhyme and alliteration. Although each non-variant shows particular subtleties, it is first attested around 985 in the so-called Hafjadinga, of which 4 lines survive. Minor but that munkareni minelos and farabina. Hi this aldi harafolda haladrotin of emiacutastali. I asked the tester of monks for a safe journey. The lord of the palace of the high ground keep the seat of the falcon over me. The author was said to be a Christian from the Hebrides who composed the poem asking God to keep him safe at sea. The meter gained some popularity in courtly poetry, as the rhythm may sound more majestic than Drotveit. We learn much about these in the Hatatal. Snorri gives for certain at least 3 different variant forms of Runiardi. These long-syllabled lines are explained by Snorri as being extra-metrical in most cases. The main form never has alliteration or rhyme in the first 2 syllables of the odd lines, and the even lines never have rhyme on the 5th, 6th syllables. The following couplet shows the paradigm. Tigi snyraogana arusona hagli. Then, the variant forms show unsurprising Drotveit patterns overall, the main difference being that the first troshi of the odd lines are technically not reckoned as extrametrical since they harbor alliteration, but the even lines' extrametrical feature is more or less as the same. The second form is the trollruniardi. In the odd lines the alliteration is moved to the first metrical position while the rhyme remains the same. In the even lines the rhyme and alliteration are not juxtaposed, and this is a key feature of its distinction. Stalakendi stek vilundum staria valdi radu folder. The next form, which Snorri calls ordinary, standard Rhyndhenda, is almost like a combination of the previous alliteration always on the first metrical position, and the rhymes in the odd lines juxtaposed. VFDI liter verdum maietiv graciardi framatarakia. There is one more form which is a bit different though seem to be counted among the previous group by Snorri, called drafon. The syllable count changes to 7. Vapna hrid veltenardi vagdalaus fem hausi. Hilmerelli acute hogam mayeta herdeklet banaverdant. As one can see, there is very often clashing stress in the middle of the line, and odd ending seems preferred. Post-medieval Scandinavian alliterative verse. Alliterative poetry is still practiced in Iceland in an unbroken tradition since the settlement, most commonly in the form of rime. The most common alliterative rime form is Verskete. German and Saxon forms. The Old High German and Old Saxon corpus of stab rhyme or alliterative verse is small. Fewer than 200 Old High German lines survive, in 4 works: the Hildebrandslide Muspilli, the Mersburg Charms and the Wess of Bran Prayer. All 4 are preserved in forms that are clearly to some extent corrupt, suggesting that the scribes may themselves not have been entirely familiar with the poetic tradition. The 2 Old Saxon alliterative poems, the fragmentary Heliand and the even more fragmentary Genesis, are both Christian poems, created as written works of biblical content based on Latin sources, and not derived from oral tradition. However, both German traditions show one common feature which is much less common elsewhere: a proliferation of unaccented syllables. Generally these are parts of speech which would naturally be unstressed: pronouns, prepositions, articles, modal auxiliaries, but in the Old Saxon works there are also adjectives and lexical verbs. The unaccented syllables typically occur before the first stress in the half line, and most often in the B verse. The Hildebrandslide, lines 4-5, the Heliand, line 3062, Salig bist thu Simon, quaith he, son u Ionis's, ni martis thu that selborgi hygien, blessed are you Simon, he said, son of Jonah, for you did not see that yourself. This leads to a less dense style, no doubt closer to everyday language, which has been interpreted both as a sign of decadent technique from ill-tutored poets and as an artistic innovation giving scope for additional poetic effects. Either way, it signifies a break with the strict verse typology. In more recent times, Richard Wagner sought to evoke Old German models and what he considered a more natural and less over-civilized style by writing his ring poems in stab rhyme. Bibliography: Bostock, J.K., revised by Casey King and Amp. Dr. McClintock. Appendix on Old Saxon and Old High German meter, a handbook on Old High German literature. Oxford University Press. CS1 maint. Uses author's parameter. Cable, Thomas. The English Alliterative Tradition. University of Pennsylvania Press. Falk, Robert D. A History of Old English Meter. University of Pennsylvania Press. Godden, Malcolm R. Literary Language. In Hogg, Richard M. The Cambridge History of the English Language. Cambridge, Cambridge University Press. pp. 490-535. Russum, Geoffrey. Beowulf and Old Germanic Meter. Cambridge University Press. Sivers, Edward. Alt-Germanisch Metrik. Niemeyer. Tolkien, J. R. On Translating Beowulf, The Monsters and the Critics, and Other Essays. George Allen and Unwin.